Hi, folks. Happy Monday. Happy spring. Thanks for joining me for Reimagining Education, conversations on character and the common good. This series is part of the Virtues and Vocations Initiative, a national forum housed at the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame for scholars and practitioners across disciplines to consider how best to cultivate character in pre-professional and professional education. My name is Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Center for Social Concerns here at Notre Dame. Quick note on logistics. As with Zoom, we often have technical challenges. Please don't worry, there are several folks behind the scenes ready to jump in. Also note that we ask you that at about the 40-minute mark to send in your questions through the Q&A, and they'll be passed on directly to me. And with that, I am thrilled to bits to introduce Rosalyn Berne on ethics and engineering education. Rosalyn is the Anne Shirley Carter Olson Professor of Applied Ethics and Director of the Online Ethics Center for Engineering and Science in the Department of Engineering and Society in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at the University of Virginia, where she has been a faculty member since 1999. Rosalyn has a BA and an MA in Communication Studies, also from the University of Virginia, and a Ph.D. in Religious Studies and Bioethics, again from the University of Virginia. As a scholar, Rosalyn explores the intersecting realms of emerging technologies, science, fiction, and myth, and the links between human and non-human worlds. Her research and writing span considerations on ethics in engineering practice, biotechnology and nanotechnology, and ethics in engineering education. She is the author of 5 books in various genres and numerous articles. As a scholar, she thinks and writes about the role of technology in our lives, especially its rapidly emerging futuristic dimensions. As a teacher, she brings science fiction into the classroom using its capacity to tweak students' moral imagination. A gifted intuitive, Rosalyn works with humans and their equine companions to facilitate deepened and meaningful communication between them. These gifts have also led her to write books in the mind, body, spirit genre, drawing from her well of experience. On leave from UVA from 2018 to 2020, she served as the director of the Center for Engineering Ethics and Society at the National Academy of Engineering and as PI of the Online Ethics Center. In September 2020, the Online Ethics Center was transferred from the National Academy of Engineering to UVA, where Dr. Berne continues to be PI and director. She is an emerita advisor of the Engineering One Planet project of the Lemelson Foundation. She is advisor to the Kern Engineering Entrepreneurship Network. She is a standing council member of Engineering Research Visionary Alliance. She is a member of the Education Committee of the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics and Autonomous and Intelligent Systems, and serves on the Ethics Committee of the American Society for Engineering Education. Clearly, she's a busy woman, and I know this is going to be great fun. Welcome, Rosalyn.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you for having me.
It's really delightful to have you here, and I'm hoping you're going to be game for a fairly wide-ranging conversation. It's just too tempting to have someone here with your range of interests not to be able to step into the different bits and pieces. And so I'm hoping to talk a little bit about ethics and character in engineering, about how race matters in engineering, about science fiction, and yes, about horses. So hoping you're game for all that.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. So I would love to sort of rewind in your academic life a bit and talk about where your twin interests in ethics and engineering might have come from. Was there a moment?
It was not a planned, intentional intertwining. My original interest in ethics actually came from a personal tragic experience. And I wanted to understand it intellectually because personally, I couldn't understand why what I thought was right might have been conceived as wrong. And just very quickly, because it's important to have the context. I had given birth to a child who had anencephaly, which is, without a brain, but I knew that this was coming because I had a dream about it the week before she was born. And so between that dream and her birth, I tried really hard to work with the University of Virginia Ethics Committee to arrange for her transplantation of her organs, because clearly she would not have survived. That attempt to transplant her organs ran smack up against ethics issues. And in the end, it didn't work out, but it was heart-wrenching. Why not? That was the right thing to do. How could it have been seen as wrong? So I went back to school, studied ethics in bioethics, and then the connecting piece is that end-of-life issues and transplantation of organs, et cetera, those don't happen without technology, right? So everything we were trying to do to make some good come from a lost life would have happened only because of technological development. So it occurred to me, one way to understand some of the difficulties we have, what we struggle with in terms of bioethics, is to look at the biotechnology that is behind those issues. And that's where it all began.
And so when you started sort of at UVA after your dissertation, what was the kind of work you were doing in the classroom at that point? Was it in the space of ethics education, or was it somewhere else?
So actually, this is craziness, but I wrote my dissertation while working full-time as the head of an independent school. And so I didn't have an academic appointment. But when the dissertation was finished, the door opened for me to go to the university, to leave that school, go to the university, and step into the classroom. And so at that point, I was teaching sort of core required courses for our department, which have to do with communication, right? And some ethics. And a student was reading a book called The Spiritual Life of Machines. And I thought, what is that? And it was Kurzweil's book. And so I thought, well, let's go to lunch. Tell me about this book. And then I started reading it. So at that point, I started thinking about the intersections of ethics, engineering, evolving and converging technologies of the future, and how sort of spirituality and religious belief might have a role to play in what we believe about where we're going and what we're doing with technology.
Wonderful. So you slipped in there that you were leading an independent school. So can we just backtrack a smidgen and talk a little bit about that in the context of what you might have taken forward from that experience into your work with engineers at UVA and that experience?
Yeah. So that being with the 5th through 12th graders, right? And what I ended up doing was, because of what I was seeing there, I changed my dissertation topic from surrogate motherhood to the search for meaning among adolescents, because I was watching them struggle. I mean, I was watching, and this happening now, I was watching depression and anxiety, and there was a rash of cutting that girls were doing, and anorexia. And I mean, it was a great school, but this was a problem nationally. And I thought, what is going on with our young people? And so I wanted to understand that, so switched the dissertation topic and started looking at the search for meaning. And so being there in that role gave me sort of a direct access to young people and to be able to observe them almost as a participant observer. And then taking what I learned from them into the engineering classroom, I could think about engineering education in light of, especially, conventional education engineers are typically 18 to 21, right? In light of their search for meaning and their values and their sense of purpose, and rituals that they create for themselves to create meaning for themselves. And so it just helped to understand my students and to think about them as individuals, not just as receptacles for the knowledge I had to bring, but as individuals who are trying to figure out who they are and who they are meant to be in this world, and what they want for themselves.
So it sounds as if you had a fairly broad notion of what engaging with questions of ethics and engineering were, right? You're talking questions of purpose, of meaning, of spirituality. And I guess it strikes me somewhat in contrast to early 21st century ways of thinking about ethics and engineering, which were much more compliance oriented. Was that your experience, or?
Well, we still have that compliance oriented thread, particularly in corporate ethics. That's primarily, as far as I can tell, what it's about. And certainly in beginning to teach engineering ethics, I had not taught it before I got into the engineering school, so I had to learn. The canon is mostly, at least was, about case studies and about codes of ethics. Right? So when I looked at most of the textbooks, they were about codes and cases. And certainly I respect that body of knowledge and literature. I think it's important. But in my own teaching, what I found is that the students were glossing over. And I thought, how are they going to actually use Kantian theory to make decisions in their personal lives? What meaning will it actually have for them once they pass the course and get the exam done? So that's when I started incorporating science fiction, because at least there you could use the creative process to put yourself into another world, and then bring that back into some of the fundamental theories. Right? And that worked pretty well.
And so, can you talk a little bit more about the role of science fiction in your pedagogy? Sort of, what are books you might typically use from science fiction? And could you give us a little taste of how you use them?
Well, actually, I follow the students. I'm a believer in Maria Montessori. So I ask the students, what are you watching? What are you reading? Who likes science fiction? Why do you like it? And then I teach what they tell me. So the first go around of that was The Matrix. This was in the 90s, and that was all the thing. And I'm like, the what? Oh, Professor Ford, you have to watch The Matrix. So I watched and I thought, no, how do you get engineering ethics out of this? Because so much of that is about consciousness, right? And the red pill versus the blue pill, right? And all that, the metaphors, but we worked with it and it was good. Because I figure go to their values, go to their world. And I learned this from being the head of an independent school. Go to their world, go to their values, and then work from that to help them understand where questions of ethics arise in the material that speaks to them. A lot of them are gamers, right? And so I didn't want to have to go there, but I needed to learn, like, why is this speaking to you? What's there? What's touching you? What's making you want to fight or want to think? So I would say, nothing that I actually made a mistake, and I ended up writing a sci-fi book myself and tried to teach it to a first-year class of 350 entering freshmen. That was a mistake. The book was really not right for them. However, that being said, I ended up teaching a course on reproductive technology ethics, and there's so much material in sci-fi around that. When I was in grad school, of course, one of my professors had us read The Handmaid's Tale. That was very helpful to me. Sci-fi is always really about now. It looks like it's about the future, but it's really always about what we value now, who we are, what we imagine in terms of where we might go and how we might live. And inside of those imaginations are clarity about what's important to us, right? So what we aspire to is a reflection of what's important to us now. So that's the way I bring it into ethics. And always, almost always, sci-fi has moral dilemmas, right? And it's got the archetypes that are working against each other. And we can look at that. We can look at myth and how myth plays out in our lives in terms of a place for struggles we don't know how to resolve. And so I don't necessarily talk to my students about it in that way because it's sort of there, but they get really animated and really involved when we incorporate sci-fi into questions of how do we know what's right and what do we do? What do we do about problems that we face?
Great. Can you talk a little bit about the role of case studies in your pedagogy, and in particular, in thinking about the cultivation of character or virtue? How does that work for you?
I would like to write a case. I'm going to have a brain freeze for a minute, but I want to remember his name. I would like to write a case to answer your question, specifically about Brad Raffensperger. And Brad Raffensperger comes up because of the last election, the 2020 election. He's the Georgia Secretary of State. He is an engineer. He owns an engineering, specialty contracting design firm. And actually, he just wrote a book called Integrity Counts. So when we talk about cases and character, this one is fresh for me because he was asked to find more votes to change the count in Georgia. And his response to that request was, I'm an engineer. We follow the numbers, right? So I'm not going to do that. And it took a lot of strength of character because he received threats from his people in his own party, threats to his wife and home. It was very, very serious. And the fact that he stood on his strength of character and his commitment to what it meant to him to be an engineer, which is, you have to be able to be trustworthy as an engineer, right? It was so moving to me. And I actually don't have to write the case because he's written his own book, but that's to me the kind of case that is essential in helping our students to understand what character can look like in the face of a really difficult, I wouldn't say it was a moral dilemma for him, but it might have been for many people, right? How do I maintain allegiance to my party and what I'm being asked to do by an authority figure, but stick to what I know is right? So that's just a recent case that comes to mind because it's sort of in my heart. And I taught it 3 weeks ago, and my students, they're 19, they had never heard of him. I'm like, oh, where were you? But that's okay, I won't judge you. I want you to know about him. And they heard him speak, and he was very quiet in the room. You could hear that it meant something to them. There are so many cases. Many of them are really, they're tragedies, they're like, oil spills, right? And accidents. But then you have the case of Volkswagen, right? It's like, what do you mean you lied? Why would you do that? And so there's lots of ways that cases can help us understand the context of engineering ethics. And then the characters within the case, we can sometimes relate to them and say, well, I want to be like that, or I don't want to be like that. I'm not going to be like that.
Mm-hmm. How do we educate students so we know they're not going to be like that, or
Right.
at least increase the chances that they're not going to be like that? What are things from your perspective we need to be doing more of and doing better?
So I recently, I hope I've been doing this for a long time, but I recently came across an article that it really inspired me. Now, let me see if I can get that for you because it was helpful. It was called Connecting to the Heart, Teaching Value-Based Professional Ethics. And it was by two scholars at Colorado School of Mines, R. Snyder and Chin-Soo. And what I really loved about it was they're arguing that you need a value-based approach in engineering education. That's the only way you can cultivate self-reflective and socially engaged engineers. So I agree with them that dominant approaches to engineering education provide really limited opportunities for students to reflect on their own values and meaning and commitments and how those will impact their professional development, right? And those traditional approaches they argue, aren't sufficient for allowing students to problematize and engage in challenges for engineering in a way that will practice in their education. So the title, do you want me to add the title?
Oh, I think somebody backstage can
Okay.
add it for everybody.
Okay, because I can do that at some point if you want. So I borrowed some of their teaching techniques recently. And even though I felt pretty good about what I've been doing, we always learn from others, right? I got really excited. One of the things they do is an ethics autobiography, which I've just started to do. Now, the way I'm doing it is I'm pulling from Jonathan Haidt's work, right? So Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-G-H-T, the psychologist, moral psychologist. So he has a chapter called Where Do Morals Come From, right? So I have the students read that so that they at least have some theory. And Haidt actually ends up going around the world to try to understand how is it some beliefs claim what's right and wrong has to do with if you hurt somebody, but others are more about sort of like pollution and revulsion and that kind of thing. So anyway, they read Haidt, they get the whole background, and then they have to start thinking about themselves from childhood on. Like, what did I learn and from whom? And when have I felt a little off kilter by a situation that threw me? And how did I approach that? And how did I know what to do? And they write this up. And it's amazing what they share. So to me, that's the beginning for them, the beginning of self-reflection in the course. It's sort of like, I don't want to just throw theory at you. I want you to be able to think, like, who am I as a moral being? And then at the end of the course, they do a personal ethics statement, which for me can take any form. It can be a poem, it can be a soliloquy, it can be a scene, where you have another character act with you. It can be a rap. I mean, it could be a poster. So you can be creative, but what it does is it asks them just envision who you will be going forward as a moral being. What does that look like, right? And it's a lot of fun for them, but they take it to heart. The other thing I've done is started working with GVV, which I think you're familiar with because I believe you interviewed Mary, yes?
I did, yes.
Yeah. And GVV, the beauty of GVV for me is that it's not so much about trying to figure out and teaching students how to figure out, right, what's the right thing to do. It's the next step beyond. It's like helping them to recognize that they have values, and from those values, they know what the right thing is to do. But how do you act on them? How do you act on them in a way that's effective for situations you might run into? So what GVV does, and the reason I'm now integrating that into my teaching, is it helps them to write scripts, right? Write scripts about situations that they might encounter, and then practice what they would be saying to try to bring resolution to a problem. And to give them an example of this, I had them listen to a section from a book written by Suzanne Simard. Do you know who Suzanne Simard is?
No, I don't.
She's a forester. She's the woman who discovered that there's a very elaborate system of communication between trees and across the species of trees that happens through the mycorrhizal fungi. So underneath the earth is this huge, vast complex of fungus, mycorrhizal, that sends signals from one tree, the mother tree, to other trees to determine where nutrients are needed in the forest. And there's like this dynamic communication so that if there's a threat, the mother tree will have certain nutrients sent to certain clusters to protect them, et cetera. So she, in her early young professional life as an intern, was asked to illegally cut down a large stand of old growth trees, it was against the law to do. But they were way up in the wilderness and no one would have known, but they would have come back, celebrated because they'd gotten these huge trees for the industry. She did not know how to say no. And so she struggles with how she dealt with that situation. I have the students listen to her talking about how as a young professional, she got stuck She felt pressure. She didn't have her voice. She knew her values, but she couldn't find her voice. And so I have them listen to that and understand from her perspective what it might be like for them as interns, young professionals in engineering, to get stuck where they feel pressure to do something and they can't find their voice. And then they write a script. If we had to do that over for Suzanne, what would we say? And then from there, they can practice writing scripts with one another and in situations that they could encounter. We watch films and documentaries, and then we write scripts based on those to change the situation using GVV.
That's fantastic. Love that.
It's working. Yeah, it's working well.
That's just really wonderful. Can we talk a little bit about race? You recently had a conversation about race and engineering. And could you share some of your thoughts there? Sort of how you're thinking about that intersection at the moment. Clearly, there's a lot has happened in the past 2 years to put that front and center for all of us. But for you personally and in your work, how are you thinking about that intersection?
Suzanne, honestly, I have tried my best to avoid dealing with race as a scholar. I haven't wanted to touch it because I don't have the training, and I also just didn't want to be pigeonholed into the person that does race, right? And which happens. So, but in the summer of George Floyd, my department chair called a meeting and said, we need to be able to help students think through what's going on in our country. Who will teach a course on engineering and race? And nobody said anything. And I said, don't you ask me. And then I realized, you know what? I want to do this. I want to do this because I think I can do it well. And it's really, really important to me that if we're going to do it, it really needs to be done sensitively and well. But I had to learn. And there's no book on engineering and race. There isn't any. So I had to, and particularly around ethics, so I had to spend that summer learning. And what I learned was actually, it was very disturbing to me. I did put together a course. I've taught it 3 times. It's been quite successful. I will probably write it up and publish it so others can teach it. I don't know that I'll do it again myself because it's emotional, it's difficult. But if you think about technology as being, and engineering as being everywhere in our lives in this culture. So if you look around your room, if our listeners start with their bodies and then look around the room, it's everywhere, right? Our lives as we know it would not be possible without it. So it becomes a medium for racist practices and institutions. So we looked at that. So for example, we looked at Standing Rock and the pipeline and the fact that it actually was rerouted because its original path went through a city where its well-to-do people didn't want it close. It went to a place where people supposedly have no voice and are not acknowledged and are not valued. It's still under legal review. It's a mess. But for the people, the Sioux people on whom that land was so important, water was critical and it was threatened. So we look at that case and we ask, how is it that a major project of infrastructure can plop down without regard for the values of the people for whom that land is sacred? And so that's a case we look at. We look at the actual engineering and design of prisons and how values are embedded in design. And so who we care about and don't care about and how we see people and who we think them to be in the society shows up in the design of prisons. It shows up in surveillance systems that are attached to people who we've called criminals. We look at some of the problems with production of oil in the Gulf and how it affects people's lives there with the rampant pollution and the high elevation of cancer and lung disease because of the petroleum production that is built in and among and around communities that have been there for a very, very long time. There are elements of racism in each of these cases. There are many. There are cases, even the simple pulse oximeter, which many of us bought during the pandemic to just check our oxygen levels, was not designed to be able to read accurately for people with dark skin. So you ask, how does something like that happen? And so in other cases, for a long time, they're starting to correct it now. But if you go into a bathroom and you put your hands on, I miss turning on the darn faucet. Go in there, you can't turn it on anymore. It uses sensors, but for a long time, those sensors didn't read dark skin. So you'd be trying to get the water or the soap and it's not coming out. It's like, what's going on here? Well, it turns out the design, of the way the light picks up the signal was tested and developed on white skin. So I looked at all those kinds of cases with our students, and the classroom became a place just to reflect together and think about, how can engineering actually change some of these institutions and these practices with new kinds of designs. AI is another really important place to be thinking about that kind of thing. So I guess it's sort of like, to me, what I've taken away is engineering reflects the values of the designers and of the society. So why would it be value neutral around race? It can't be. It's going to reflect who we are at a given time in its design. All the way back, even the cotton gin, brilliant, right? It's a much more efficient way to clean cotton. Because of it, slavery boomed because the market for cotton went way up and you needed people to pick it, right? So it's all part of social technical systems where one thing affects the other, right? Technology affects economies, affects cultures and peoples and values, and it's all in there together. We have to parse it out and think about it carefully in terms of what we mean to do and who we care about and what we're trying to accomplish.
Could you describe a little bit the student response to this? This, right, it's clearly an extraordinary set of cases, really trying to open the way students think about what it is to be an engineer and the kinds of ethical responsibilities. You've talked about tweaking the moral imagination, and this sounds very much a part of what that course likely was. How did students respond to that?
It was amazing. We were learning together. In fact, I told them, this is not my field of scholarship. I don't know any more than you do. Let's learn together. This was a course, it was an elective, so that's different. My engineering ethics course is a requirement. So students only took it because they wanted to. In fact, some students took it as an overload because they wanted to so much that they just carried it in excess to their normal. We had grads and undergrads together, and mostly I had students leading the classes. They responded heartfelt, troubled, but also glad to have a space in the school to be able to talk about race, intellectually and personally. So sometimes a student would say, well, I know about this because, I've got 3 uncles in prison, or I know about this because, so-and-so lives in Louisiana and, is in the shadow of this. What they didn't know about is any of First Nations history in the United States. So we spent the early part of the semester just doing history. They're like, I didn't know, because we've made, at least in this part of the country, we've made First Nations people invisible. And it was intentional to integrate them in a way that they would sort of disappear as a culture. And so our students, no surprise, they don't know the history, and they were concerned. Now, the second year I taught the course was after the election, and Asian American students were feeling anxious because, it was after COVID had started. They were feeling anxious because of reference to COVID as, the Asian disease or the whatever, China virus, and there was violence and there were threats to people of Asian Americans, and they didn't have anywhere to talk. We got to talk about COVID and racism toward Asian Americans in the class. That year, my enrollment went way up in terms of Asian American students to almost 40% of the class, which the first semester was not. And I think it's because of what was happening nationally. It was like, I need a place to be where I can speak and think and be understood. It was really important.
Great, thank you for that. we talk about horses? So I am so fascinated by your work with horses and this notion that you are a horse whisperer. So Bray, and I'm hoping we can kind of connect the dots to your life with engineering and with ethics, but connect the horses into this picture because, yeah, I just think it's extraordinary. So maybe you could just give us a bit of a primer on what this is, your experience, and then we can loop back.
Okay, of course. So, 12 years ago, I was riding a horse in Costa Rica. I fell off of the horse into the river. And when I stood up, I was laughing for glee. I don't know why. I had not hit my head. I was fine. But the horse clearly was looking at me with trepidation. He was up on the bank. He was really upset. I pat him on the butt. I said, Titan, I'm fine. Don't worry. Climb back up on, and we begin to ride. And after a few minutes, it's as if a signal turned on in my head. It's like a radio signal turned on in my head. And I hear the words, I can't believe you fell off. Nobody's ever fallen off of me before. I'm going to get in trouble. I know I'm going to get in trouble. This is terrible. I didn't do my job. I didn't protect you. How could this have happened? Are you not hurt? And I finally said, Titan, I'm fine. Stop worrying. And it was quiet for a minute. And then I heard him say, you can hear me? I said, yeah, I can hear you. So we have this whole conversation. And I said, I'm clumsy. I fell. It's not your fault. Why would you get in trouble? And then we're almost back. And I hear him say, since I know you can hear me, I need your help. Would you help me? I said, yeah. He said, tell Debbie, and Debbie's the name of the owner of this retreat, tell Debbie she's wrong. I don't need to go back for more training. I just need a break once in a while. Well, I was not sure what to do with that. I waited for the other riders to go away. I didn't want anybody else to hear. I told the owner about it, and she was stunned. She said, you can't know about that. You can't possibly have known about that. We have been talking about sending him back for more training, but you weren't here. How do you know? And I said, he told me. Well, fast forward, I've now communicated with, 30 or 40 horses, written about it in a book called When the Horses Whisper. It's a gift that came. I didn't know how to connect it to engineering education and ethics, but now I do. And I'm going to write about it at some point, but here's how I think it's important to connect. I believe that I have learned through these horses that all life, all mammals, all living beings, and now we know from Suzanne Simard's work, all forests and trees within the forest are connected in a web. And in that web, I believe, evolving all together. If we are thinking about climate change and sustainability only in terms of human survival, we will not succeed. I think it's essential that we think about it in terms of the whole. And otherwise, I'm very concerned that we're not going to survive. I think we have a chance if we contextualize our engineering practices towards sustainability in terms of the connection of the whole of life, that all species have to be part of our calculations in terms of the sustaining the life of the whole. And I think that was really the most important takeaway for me. Not so much, sort of, it's like the macroethics and the microethics. On the micro scale, I want to make sure people take good care of their horses, that they understand their needs, that they're not mistreated, because we mistreat them in the racing industry and we mistreat them. They've served us in war. They've served us in mining. They got us across the country when we were pioneers. Horses have been essential to the well-being of humans, and we have not always taken good care of them. That's the microethics. Take care of your horse. Be good to your horse. On the macroethics, it's like, what does it mean that we have this relationship with these beings on whom we have essentially depended? What does that mean in terms of how we are engineering our world, right? Should they be part of that conversation, part of that a factor in design, right? So I believe if we factor all of life into design, we will live sustainably. We will take care of the earth. And that's, I think, the essential message that transfers that personal experience to my thinking about ethics.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Some questions are teeing up, so I'm going to transition to a couple of them to get rolling. So the first question, you've followed the tide of your interest in lots of different directions, and many of them seem to lead in productive directions. Can you describe your decision-making process as you discover new things? How do you know which way to go and which ones to let go of? And how do you understand intuition? So that's a tough one. So how do you end up where you are?
It's the hardest question ever. Oh my goodness, it's the hardest question ever. In fact, I went to know which way to go. I asked that over and over, but I will say I am learning to trust my intuition. If I had been a disciplined scholar, I would have stayed the course in one area, gotten deeper and deeper and deeper, mastered one field, and been known for that. And I envy sometimes people who do that. It's not me. What I seem to do is things come up, and they come up from a deep place, and I can't ignore them because of the source of that. So the intuitive, connected part of myself, I can't ignore. So even though it might look circuitous and like I've wandered, all the connections are starting to become apparent to me. And the way it's helping me to understand the world and myself in the world and who we are as the engineers of this world is now starting to make sense. But individual decisions about opportunities and choices, that has been really hard. And if I had the easy answer, I would happily provide it. But I still struggle with that because new opportunities come often, and I don't always know what to do with them. Saying no. So Anne Morrow Lindbergh wrote a book, Gifts from the Sea. And she realized after a day at the beach, she couldn't take everything home that she'd found. It's a beautiful metaphor. I do have to leave a lot on the shore. But sometimes I pick something up and it's like, no, I'm supposed to carry this one. I'm supposed to imbibe this one. Sorry, that's the best I can do.
That's great. Thank you for that. The second part of the question asks about the notion of intuition. And you've described yourself as an intuitive person. What would that mean? And it seems to connect to this question that you somehow know which directions are fruitful for you.
So I think that there's a research project going on called Heart Math, where what they're learning is that the deepest intuition comes from the integration of the heart with the mind, so with the rational with the heart. And of course, in some cultures, the heart is the center. For us, the brain is the center. Right? We're very cerebrally centered and oriented. I think that that research is helpful for me in understanding what it means for myself. It's like if the ego struggle to be dominant and rational is quieted sometimes, something else emerges and connects with it. And I think that's actually what helps me to be able to understand horses. Horses are completely heart-centered, right? They pump much, much, much more blood per minute than we do, which is an indication of that. So I think that in the ability to merge those two, and I do a lot of contemplative practices and meditation practices, I think the ability to merge those two is what gives rise to the intuition. And then learning to trust that, particularly in the face of rational processes where, you might want to question what is wrong with you? Why would you do this? That's not rational. But I'll do it if it doesn't cause harm, right? It doesn't cause harm, then I can go beyond the rational and say, what more is there for me to perceive and to understand to help me sense what's going on in this situation? Great. So it's trust. A lot of it is trusting that voice in yourself.
Next question. You mentioned earlier that Maria Montessori's ideas about education have influenced your teaching career. Can you say a bit more about that? And do you meet many college and university professors who have been influenced by her thinking?
Well, there is a scholar at UVA, Angela, she goes by Angel. Angeline Lillard, who is a scholar of Montessori education. But of course, she's looking at the efficacy of Montessori in terms of learning outcomes and also the quality of life adults and what they're able to do as adults. When I say I was influenced by Maria Montessori, it's the part about following the child or following the learner in order to meet them where they are and follow their own motivations for learning and their own curiosities for learning. So that's why I often ask my students, what is of interest to you? And I'm listening for it all the time. I'm watching for it so that I can speak to it and address it. And that way, I am following them, not just asking them to receive my knowledge. Right? And that's what I mean by the influence of Montessori.
Wonderful. Next one. What daily practice do you recommend for developing moral virtue as an adult?
Yeah, I think self-reflection is awfully important. And also sort of recognizing conflicting values in ourselves. So it's pretty easy to put on the cloak of identity of a good person and say that that's who we are. But I think in reality, because of the nature of life, there are often times when we are in conflict with our own values. And so to recognize those and to embrace them, I think that's an important daily practice. And that gives us a chance to sort of see the role we play in our relationships and our situations and where we have responsibility for the things we do.
Are there practices you employ in your daily life in terms of reflection of some sort?
Well, I've been a daily meditator for 40 years, right? That's just sort of you brush your teeth, you meditate, sort of what I do. And that, for me, that practice just gives me a chance to step back and be the observer of all that activity in my busy mind and realize that there is a me that is not that busy activity and to sit in that really quiet, peaceful space. And that space allows me a sense of peace and a sense of joy, even in the midst of a really trying time in this world. And then I can bring that into my writing and in my teaching. I also actually have stopped reading the paper every day because it's getting to be emotionally difficult. It feels like an addiction to something that is sometimes toxic. So actually, I read less of the news than I used to. I know basically what's going on, but I don't follow the feed as much because I had to step back just to take care of myself. If I could, I would sit down and read for an hour every day, but my goodness, the email will not let me do that. And that makes me mad because it means we follow the technology beyond what we've evolved to be able to do, and we can't keep up with it. And it's really, really making me mad. And I don't know how to get back from it. And I wish we would find a way out because we're in deep now. And
That's great. I think there are probably lots of people who sympathize with that perspective. Do you find that students take the questions and concerns raised in your engineering ethics courses into their other engineering courses, into courses required for their engineering major? Are there other elements of the engineering curriculum at UVA that get ethics into the major?
I wish I could say, oh, sure they do. And I would like to know that. I only know that if they tell me. And sometimes what happens is they tell me later, like a semester or two later, they'll write and say, guess what, Professor Berne? We had a lecture in mechanical engineering today, and it reminded me of when we did XYZ in your class. And that is so heartening. Isn't that why we teach? We want them to be able to integrate across the curriculum and into their lives. I would like to think we could do it more intentionally. And so to me, ethics across the curriculum is ideal. Right now, it is still a single freestanding course at our university. I think if there were a way that we could find the motivation and the time to go across the curriculum, it would be better. But with engineering education, there's so much pressure to fulfill the teaching objectives. And even now, there's a lot of pressure to add more courses, technical courses. We're not there yet. But as I say, I'm heartened when I hear stories down the road of like the light bulb going off. And I think I'd like to think more carefully about how to do that intentionally. Thank you for bringing that up.
Great. It seems like for many people tend to lose the forest for the trees, and you've just beautifully described your sense that we need to sustain a sense of the whole and our connectedness in it in ethics. How do you sustain that sense, the sense of the forest and of our connectedness to it when so many things seem to conspire against us and make us focus on the trees and not the forest? You have this extraordinary sense of repose and yeah.
I'm pausing for a moment because I'm looking out of my window into a forest. And yet the individual trees, right? And so you don't have one without the other, right? You need the individual trees to make a forest, but they only exist because of the whole. How do we remember that? Well, literally, I like to go out and be with them, those trees, but figuratively, I think that we can do that in our classroom with each other, right? So if there's a way of teaching where we are acknowledging the individual learner and seeing them while also building a sense of collective connection as a classroom where students feel like they're part of a whole when they come to class, that helps to translate into how we live in the larger world. Right, so it can begin in the classroom. So that to me is a space of learning together collectively and genuinely listening to one another because we care about one another. If we can create that space, I think that fosters a sense of meaning and value and working together for something greater than our individual selves.
You talked about the use of ethics autobiography in your engineering class. How did you come up with that approach? Do you think this approach has influence on students after they graduate, this notion of their ethical autobiographies? Talk a lot about ethical practice. Do you have any sense if they carry it forward into their life beyond?
Okay, so the host and panelists will be able to see this. Oh wait, you found the article already, never mind. So I got that assignment from that article, Connecting to the Heart, Teaching Value-Based Professional Ethics. I thought that was brilliant. I've only been using it for the last year and a half. So I have not assessed that particular assignment, but when you read those essays, oh my goodness, they are so illuminating in terms of who these students are and their own, I think, expanded sense of themselves as a result of writing this, because they've never been tasked to do anything like this before. So I think it'd be great if I could write to them when they're fourth years, because right now they're first and second, and ask them, you remember that assignment you did? Mm-hmm. What would happen if you wrote it again, right? Or what does that mean to you? That would be a really good assessment tool, but I haven't done it yet. I just borrowed this assignment from the article and just started using it recently, but I'm pretty sure I will always do this as long as I'm still teaching ethics. It just feels like it's working.
Great. So what's next for you?
I'm sorry?
What's next for you? Sort of where's the next direction, the new inspiration? You mentioned you wanted to write another book integrating some of the ideas, but sort of what's on your radar?
Right. So I'm going through a process of discernment, whether to go back into a leadership position or whether to stay focused on my scholarship and teaching entirely. And if I'm staying focused on my teaching and scholarship, I would like to be able to, one, provide an article to help people who want to teach about race and engineering, because I'm not planning to do that myself, either an article or a book of resources as just sort of a gift to the field. And then I can let it go and feel like, okay, I did my part. And I also think there is something to be written, and I'm still trying to figure out how, but something to be written that better integrates what I've learned from animal studies and animal communication. And I am involved with a group in Saskatchewan right now. They are studying how this mechanism happens with animal communicators. And it is actually empirical work. It's really exciting. Maybe through that collaboration, I can integrate it with engineering education and ask, how can intuition and interconnectivity between species inform engineering design or engineering education? That would be amazing. If I could figure out how to do it, that could be next.
If you were to recommend one thing we read, what would it be?
Well, that article about connecting the heart, read that. That's good. And read Suzanne Simard. That changed my whole sense of life on the planet, right? Or watch a documentary about her. That's just really important work about the interconnections of life.
Well, great. So I just want to thank you for this extraordinary conversation. I've loved the kind of free-ranging nature of it. And it's just a fantastic way to begin spring. Sort of opening up some new ways of thinking and being in the world. So thank you for that. And on April 25th at noon, Carnegie Mellon University Tepper School of Business Associate Professor Tanya Cohen will discuss honesty and moral character with us. So if you're free, I hope you all will join us with that. But again, thank you so much, Rosalyn. This has just been super fun. Yeah, and yeah. Really
My
inspiring,
pleasure.
and I wish I was one of your students. So
thank you for your questions, Suzanne. I appreciate it.
great. Have a wonderful afternoon.
You too.